Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our penultimate study in Philippians together. I hope you've been rejoicing in it. I hope that you've been learning lots from it. It's been a great encouragement to me, and I hope it has been to you as well over these past few months. Why don't we pray as we get into this penultimate text this morning? Our Father, would you give us spiritual sight this morning? Help us to see you and see the world as you see it. And please would you change our hearts to be drawn towards you and in your service as we wait for that day when Jesus brings us home. Please help us to delight in your purposes in the world. For Jesus' sake. Amen. Money, and especially giving, are subjects that we don't like to talk about. By we, I mean Brits. To be honest, we'd rather talk about almost everything else, anything else, than money. And by we, I also mean us clergy. Everyone knows that the vicar's livelihood depends on the generosity of the church. And so we clergy are often afraid to talk about money because it sounds like we've got the begging bowl and we're rattling the tin and asking you for more. But the combination of a natural British reticence to talk about money combined with clergy embarrassment means that we often have no idea what the Bible actually says about the subject because we avoid it, all of us. We never ask the question. And I think Paul knows exactly the struggles that we clergy have. As we've seen, the purpose of Paul's letter is that the Philippians reconcile the differences between them, especially Euodia and Syntyche, as we saw at the beginning of chapter 4, in order that the whole church stands united together, pressing on towards the goal to which God has called them. Well, that's the purpose of the letter, but the occasion of the letter is the generous gift of money from the Philippians to Paul. How generous? Verse 18 tells us. I have received full payment and have more than enough, he says. I am amply supplied. See, from Paul's perspective, he's got an abundance. And from the Philippian perspective, because they're a relatively poor church in a poor part of the world, it would have been a costly gift. But still, Paul waits until the end of the letter to talk about money because he doesn't want the church to misread him. He doesn't want to focus on the money at all. And yet at the same time, Paul does address the money. Indeed, the Bible talks about money all the time. If we clergy avoid it, if we fail to speak about it when the Bible does, we're actually failing to serve the church properly. And here is a classic passage to explain why that's so dangerous. Paul will talk about money and specifically giving. He will expect their generosity to continue. Indeed, in the context of the letter, it's clear that mature Christianity demands a self-sacrificial generosity with money. My friends, we cannot claim to be mature disciples of Jesus and be stingy with the wealth God has given to us. It's not an option. So this passage may well convict us this morning. It may highlight a particular sin in our lives. If it does, let's remember the gospel according to Philippians. Paul, remember, was someone who killed Christians for a living. But he was wonderfully converted, cleansed by the death of Jesus Christ, we saw in chapter 2. So now Paul forgets the past and presses on towards the goal. Each today is a new day. There's always forgiveness for past sins and resurrection power in the present to enable us to change and become more Christ-like. But still, Paul expects us to be generous with money. We mustn't try to avoid that fact this morning. And yet at the same time, we have to locate Paul's teaching here about money in two important contexts. The first is that giving financially is part of the wider gospel partnership. See, already in the letter, we've seen that the Philippians partner with Paul in prayer, in people, and in the case of Epaphroditus, his health too. Sweaty striving together for the gospel is a whole life thing, not just a money thing. As we talk about money primarily this morning, because that's what Paul does, we can apply everything that Paul says to how we think about our time, our gifts, our energy. We're going to be reminded of that our striving reaches to every part of our lives, not just to our wallets. The second context is this. Although Paul wants them to keep giving sacrificially, his focus in this passage is not as the recipient of the gift, but rather on their gift and their relationship with God. Paul wants to help us to see what money is in spiritual terms so that we make wise decisions about what we do with it. So in this first part, we're going to look at the Philippian generosity so far and see that Paul is encouraging them to keep going, to keep pressing on towards the goal. And we'll think about the implications for us in that. Then we'll look at 4 spiritual realities that ought to strengthen us to be selfless, indeed recklessly generous, for the sake of the gospel. So first of all, let's look at their present persistent partnership, verses 14 to 16. You'll remember that right back at the beginning of the letter, Paul talked about their partnership in the gospel from the first day, their conversion, until now. As Paul reviews their Christian discipleship to date, they get A stars all across the board. But he then encourages them that he who began a good work in them, that is God, will bring it to completion in the future. Paul has seen their discipleship both as past and future. See, it seems to me at least that the letter to the Philippians arrives at a point of decision for the church. Maybe they're under social pressure. Perhaps they're looking at Paul in prison and thinking that his gospel isn't worth it anymore. I think from reading chapter 4, it's likely that the Philippians, who've given so much of themselves to Paul's ministry over the last 10 years, are beginning to feel vulnerable. Their giving has left them without the security of big savings in their bank accounts, as it were. They're afraid. They've become vulnerable. And so they're faced with a decision whether to press on into ever more sacrificial giving of their money, energy and time, or whether to pull back, to hold back. Now, Paul is in no doubt that they will press on. God will complete the good work he's begun in them. And in this passage, he reminds them of their exemplary service so far. Our passage this morning is about that partnership idea. The word translated share in verses 14 and again in verse 15 is a partnership word. So listen to verse 14. Yet it was good of you to share in my troubles. Their gift to Paul is partnership. It is taking his suffering and sharing in it. Moreover, it's not their first act of partnership either. Verse 15, when I set out from Macedonia, of which Philippi is the capital, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you only. The Philippians at that point were brand new Christians, but they were so excited about the good news that had come to them through Paul that they wanted others to hear about it too. So as Paul went off to Thessalonica and Berea, the church in Philippi sent him with gifts. Not only so, but verse 16, you sent me aid more than once when I was in need, he says. When Paul looks back over their partnership, their great concern for him and the gospel has led them to give generously time and time again. Their giving shouldn't be extraordinary. It should be normal for Christians to give like that. It's simply the fruit of understanding the gospel and applying it to our hearts and our wallets. But it was extraordinary in its time. It is said, this is attributed to Luther, but it may have come from somewhere else, but certainly I think it's a truism that sticks, isn't it? It is said that a person is converted head first, heart second, and wallet last. But the Philippians were all in, right from the beginning, weren't they? None of the other churches partnered with Paul in the way that they did. They were and remain a model church. That's why Paul holds them up as an example for the wealthier Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 8. It's copy these guys, they got it right. Other churches might not be generous, but that's no reason for the Philippians to pull back from their joyful, sacrificial giving to gospel causes. So I wonder this morning, how do the Philippians look to you? Do they seem extraordinary to us? Why? The principle here and throughout the New Testament is crystal clear, isn't it? When we turn to follow Jesus, we entrust everything we are and everything we have to him. We trust him. The money we have was his before it came to us, and it remains his, and he has the right to tell us how to deal with it. Perhaps they seem extraordinary. Perhaps we sympathise with the Philippians. Maybe you've been very generous in the past with your time and energy and money, and you're tempted to ease off a bit. But Paul's purpose here in this passage is that the Philippians press on as they have been doing. Not thinking about the world, but considering everything rubbish except for knowing Jesus. Perhaps we find the Philippians inspiring. Perhaps we look around our church family, so to speak, and think, wouldn't it be brilliant if we were just completely sold out like the Philippians were? Paul would encourage us to take a step forward towards that deeper discipleship today. We can none of us be mature believers without the principle of selfless generosity taking control of us. Paul holds the Philippians up as a model for us. In the first place, in fact, he holds them up to themselves, as if in a mirror, to show them the beauty of Christ's likeness that they already share in, and then to encourage them to keep going, not to withdraw and turn back and disfigure themselves when they're such a beautiful church. They are a model also to us, aren't they? Whatever generosity looks like for us, that is what we're aspiring towards. Of course, giving is painful if we do it properly. Sacrificial giving impacts on the things we want to do or want to have. In one sense, it's a very practical way of counting this world rubbish, isn't it? Of relativizing the value of this world to the next and deciding to pursue Christ with our whole heart. Put all our eggs in that basket. And if we do it properly, it's painful because it makes us more vulnerable, just like the Philippians. Perhaps we've got lots of savings and we hold on to those savings because they insulate us against an unknown future. If we think in either of those ways, or indeed in both of those ways, that money is a means of stuff and experiences, and that money is a protection against an uncertain future, Paul would say to us, you are stunting your spiritual growth. You are stunting your spiritual growth. And so Paul is going to lay before us this morning 4 spiritual realities. And if we grasp these truly by faith, we'll find that our desires for this world diminish, our fears of being vulnerable vanish, and we'll be freed from those anxieties to grow into the selfless, even recklessly generous people that Paul wants us to be. Well, before we see those things, we're going to remind ourselves that we entrust ourselves to a loving Father who cares for us, in the words of "Come, people of the risen King." Let's sing together.